Hello and welcome to the Brave Business Podcast, brought to you by the accounting, tax, audit and advisory firm Blick Rothenberg. Brave by name and brave by nature, this series is different. Aimed at entrepreneurial businesses, we focus on providing market updates, practical guidance, timely insights and professional opinions from industry experts, helping you make informed decisions for your business. I'm Declan Curry, journalist and broadcaster. Today we ask if and when you should sell your business, and we'll look at some of the big questions. Who might buy it? How much you might get for it? And what are the tax and legal considerations that you need to keep in mind? Sharing their expertise on this from Blick Rothenberg, its corporate tax partner Rob Goodley, and our guest is Phil Ives, who's started and run a number of companies himself and is now a business advisor at Bean Partners. Gentlemen, welcome to our discussion. Rob, I'll come to you in a minute. Phil, let's get your story first of all. What's your background? What's your experience? Tell me about yourself.
Okay. First career actually was in the arts as a struggling actor and writer. And in one of my jobs to pay the mortgage, I fell into B2B media, which is a grandiose way of saying conferences and exhibitions. And my role essentially was as a researcher, a business researcher. And that was my journey to fall in love with the world of business and actually ultimately believe there's more creativity, opportunity in the world of business than there was for me in the world of the arts.
There's a whole other series of podcasts to be done on people who ended up doing what they're doing entirely by accident.
I would have shot myself as a teenager if I'd have thought I'd end up where I am now, but it's so much more gratifying and fulfilling. And on the back of that, I guess that somewhere underneath there was a sort of an entrepreneurial muscle that I then started to flex, and over the course of the best part of 20 years, built, ran, sold, or as I now say, gave away 3 different businesses. Before spending a couple of years working to set up a business called Global Data PLC today. And the last 10 years, I've gone to the dark side of business advisory, where I'm a partner in a consulting corporate finance business called Bean Partners.
So you are a serial entrepreneur. You have created companies, you have sold companies, and you liked it so much you did it all over again.
Yeah, well, I made every mistake in the book along the way, so I keep going and keep trying to get it right. But I describe myself more as a recovering entrepreneur these days.
Mistakes are good if we learn from them. So we'll talk about the learnings a little bit later. The first business that you sold, tell me more about it.
So I was partial owner. I was the CEO, and it was a very successful business from a growth point of view. We were, I think, technically a gazelle company, as they call it. I think the definition of that is a minimum of 20% growth every year, year on year, for a minimum of 5 years on the trot. It puts you in something like 0.2% of businesses. So sounds cool, right? And we were turning over 13.6 million and about 3 million of EBITDA on that. And I thought, happy days, I'm on for a good outcome here, and decided to sell the business at the point when I was suffering badly from stress and anxiety and all that lovely stuff that so often happens for business founders.
So that was the pivot point. That was the point when you thought
I could do no more. And it happened very quickly. Within about 18 months of going, this is amazing, I went, this is just hell.
Was it in your mind from the very start that at some point you would sell the business?
No, I just sort of thought one day it'll happen. And when I got to the point that I needed to sell for my own personal well-being, I then found I'd managed to build a very successful business from certain metrics, such as growth and revenue and profit, but not actually from the other metrics that will tell you whether your business is valuable or not.
Thinking about that business and the other businesses that you have set up, talk me through the thought process, that sense of when you think it is time to sell, and then when you start the process of finding out how much other people think it's worth.
I repeated the same formula then 3 times, essentially. Let's build a business and hope I can sell it. And each time I got to the point of wanting to sell it, I found out that it wasn't worth anything like what I hoped it would be. And that if I stuck around for another 2 to 3 years and did certain stuff, then maybe I'd get a very different result. But each time I just wasn't in the right place to do that. So I moved on and went again. So the next steps, in my case, I was of the school that believed you're probably better off to get an advisor on board. So I started talking to advisors And the advisors rocked up and they promised all sorts of amazing outcomes, and they quoted certain numbers and timeframes that they'd be able to sell the deal. And then the reality that turned out bore no resemblance whatsoever to what I'd been led to believe.
While you're saying this, I'm looking at Rob to see if there's any sort of flicker of recognition in his eyes that might be How do you see the process? Do you wait for business owners to come to you, or are you actively looking, listening for information about what might be coming on the market?
Yeah, I think best case scenario, you're constantly having discussions with your client, and this comes out naturally years before a sale process is on the horizon. So clients are saying to you, or you're saying to them, what's your long term aim, for this business? And if it is to sell, okay, let's start thinking about that early and speaking to the right advisors.
Do you know before they do that it's time to sell?
Great question. Sometimes, yes, I think that's right. I mean, it's
they're too close to it.
They're too close to it. It's difficult to let go at times. Yes, I think when you're so close to it, you don't always you have a skewed view of what the value of the business is. I think either way, it can be either way, certainly. But taking those external sounding boards, I think, can bring you closer to reality in some cases.
Okay. How did you feel? How did you start the conversation with the advisors?
Well, actually, it started off, I was anchored back to the first business because that was arguably the worst result of all. I started off with, what can I get for this and how quickly can you get me out of it? I mean, it really was as simple as that. I'd been going for a little while trying to solve all the problems that had grown in the business with growth. With growth comes complexity, and we did not have systems and structure and all that lovely sort of process stuff in place. So it was becoming highly dysfunctional and an utter nightmare to run. So actually, my context was more about getting out than it was about getting any specific number as a result of a sale.
You think it's worth X. They think it's worth Y.
Yeah.
Do you just accept the valuation, or is there a bit of resistance there? Does it cross your mind? If I had a different advisor, I'd get a different number?
Yeah, well, I spoke to a number of advisors, and they all said roughly the same thing. Oh, you'll be between a 6 and an 8 in terms of the multiple, something like that. So I just bought into that as being a statement of truth, which now I know is just rubbish. But
what are the maths, Rob? If you're a business owner, you're listening to this, you've sort of reconciled yourself to the idea that you might have to sell this precious creation of yours. You might have to sell the baby. What do you need to think about when you're working out what it's worth in the real world?
So I think this is where, a partner like Beam Partners is all important, but sadly not always appointed. I think too often a business owner will say, well, look, I know that businesses in my sector sell for X times their EBITDA, with EBITDA being a profit measure. So that number say 6 to 8. So, and I think I know who will buy the business. So I'll approach them and say, look, this is the multiple in our industry. Will you buy me for that number? And actually, as Phil can talk to, that will almost always get you a worse result than if you'd appointed an advisor who is well informed about your market space. Because in most cases, you don't know the entire size of your buyer pool, and the multiple you've picked out could well be not appropriate for your business because of various factors.
Of course, now you're an advisor.
I am indeed.
So you've seen it from both sides.
I have.
What are your thoughts?
There's a statistic that I just can never get away from, which we're obsessed at Beam Partners with research and data and all that lovely stuff. And there's research done by Forbes, actually, which has concluded that of all the businesses that attempt to sell, 90% actually fail to do so.
Does that mean they're unsellable, or does it mean that attempt fails, but a subsequent one will be successful?
It could be the latter, but very often, ultimately, they don't sell. So one in 10 actually sell. So 9 out of 10 that attempt to sell their business never actually get a result.
Do we know why that 9 out of 10 does not sell?
There's a ton of reasons around that. Obviously, anything from some key metrics and business model dynamics and market characteristics, and maybe there just was never an acquirer pool. There's one key bit which is so often not understood and which is missed, and which I was blissfully unaware of when I was actually running my own companies, which is there is such a thing as a business life cycle that all businesses go through. They go through exactly the same cycle in exactly the same stages, albeit in their own time frame. And if you get your head around that model, it involves, there's good times, obviously. We workshop this quite often with business owners these days, and they'll say, oh, when we started off, we were all excited. It's a feelings-based model. We started off excited, then it got frantic, and then we were kind of anxious. Oh no, is it going to work? And then there's a fundamental moment when the feelings shift to confidence. So it's like, this is really going to happen. We call that the first brick wall in relation to a model that was built by Sherlaw's group. And then off we go into the good times, happy days, good, strong, steady, incremental growth. And then you hit a moment of, wow, this is just amazing, euphoric payback kind of thing. Everybody we hire is a superstar, and I can leap tall buildings in one go, and I can do no wrong. And unfortunately, that bit doesn't last very long, because usually we then head off into a stage called frustration, which is something to do with the fact that the business is now growing really rather quickly, and with growth comes complexity, and the systems and structure and processes that I put in place right at the start are no longer fit for purpose. So inefficiencies are growing and the profit goes down, and now people are moaning around the place, the BMWs, as I used to call them, the bitches, moaners and whiners, who start talking about the fact that things aren't going as well as they used to go in the old days. And on we go. It gets worse. In my own case, and I'm very happy to admit this, I ended up on antidepressants because the stress that came with trying to keep this beast going was serious. And there'd be days I literally couldn't drag myself into the office, and it gets even worse from that. And you hit a moment in the model which is called the second brick wall, which is a moment of fundamental disillusion, which is the why am I doing this? And in my case, it took 18 months to go from this is why I did this to why am I doing it? And that started my process to think of just get me the hell out of here.
How commonplace is that? Because I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs. I've hardly ever had this conversation. And I think that says as much about you as it does anything else, that you having the bravery to talk about it here on this podcast.
Yeah, I'm on a bit of a mission, really, to float around society and talk to entrepreneurs and business owners and help them understand. You realize what you've got yourself into here. And I think when you look at the research and the data on this, if you found a business, you've automatically subscribed to the small subset of society that's most likely to suffer from anxiety and sleep deprivation and addiction and all these kind of things. So it's serious stuff. And then the bit that breaks my heart is these are people that are usually well-intended. They put their own money in or their family's money in or all this kind of stuff, and they end up not actually being able to sell this asset that they built after 20 years maybe of having employed people and done a load of amazing stuff, but they do not get a fair reward, a fair payback for the risk they've taken and the stress that they've suffered. Whereas I now know that if you do certain things to a business at certain stages, you are far, far, far more likely to get an outcome that feels fair. Sounds childish, but I'm talking fairness here. I think it's a fair reward is deserved for entrepreneurs.
Okay, let's set out some of those steps. Start with step number one.
Okay, step number one, it's not my quote, I can't remember who said it, but begin with the end in mind. So a massive learning I got around this whole topic, which is very strange because I was my own boss for 20 years and I then had a boss for 2 years who was a guy called Mike Danson, who'd sold his first business, which was called Data Monitor, which he sold for 502 million quid. And when I got to know Mike, it was clear on day one when he set up Data Monitor, he was planning to sell it for 500 million quid. Don't miss the 2 million that he actually sold it for on top of that. He's particularly proud of that. But that was the game. He had no idea how he was going to sell for 500 mil, but that was the mission. That's where he began. And that was the lens through which he looked at everything in relation to selling that business.
The importance of that is what? Is that it provides a focus, it shows you an end point, it is a reality check. What is it?
Yeah, it means you operate contextually. So, and I acknowledge for some business owners, selling the business is not important. So obviously I'm just talking for those for whom it is important. But if that's important, well, that's the context to me that you build a business. And there are certain things that you do that will create value in a business that will influence what that multiple is that you get of EBITDA that Rob mentioned earlier, which I was blissfully unaware of, which most business owners are blissfully unaware of. So if I understand that, I can build it.
So if you have that in your head from the very start, your decision-making, your behavior as a creator of the business will be different.
Completely. And it's exactly that. It's context. I think the definition of context is that which gives meaning. So every decision that I make has meaning. So rather than, do I get an apple or a banana? Well, the answer is which one's going to grow the value of the business. And Mike Danson, he's all about share price. So every decision is really easy in terms of, well, will it push the share price up or not make any difference? And the answer is very, very quick usually.
Next steps?
Research, data, understand your market. Again, the sad reality is that, and I'll first party this is what I did, is I believed I knew my industry and my market. Actually, most business owners don't have a full market picture, we did a piece of work recently with a smallish medical devices business in the northwest of England that was founded and owned by a guy who'd been there 25 years. He thought he knew every individual, every company in that space, and he set us a bit of a challenge to find out if there were other medical devices specifically in the northwest of England that he hadn't come across, and we found 11 of them. So the difference there is profound. This is where you can end up building your business based on real data, on checked facts, if you like, rather than believed facts. And beware what you get into, because the facts will sometimes tell you great stuff, and other times they'll tell you, you know what, you're not in a transactable market. If you've got that kind of business with that business model, chances are you'll never sell it.
And Rob, the importance of this then is that when you and your fellow advisors step in at the point where the business owner says, I want to sell, it makes a huge difference to what it is you've got to sell.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important to not be reactionary, I think. And this is the whole point Phil makes about.
What do you mean by that?
So I think too often business owners get to these brick walls that Phil talks about and say, I've gone as far as I can. I can't take this any further. I'm going to sell the business. Or there's one single factor which is driving their decision making, like I'd like to retire. And actually, I've decided now's the time, so I'm just going to sell. And that's when you reach a bad outcome. Because on the commercial front, as Phil talks about, you need to kind of think about a number of factors in the round to get the best result. From a kind of advisor perspective, you don't want to just be shoving a business on the market and hoping it sells. You need to have a really deep dive look at the business to make sure you understand any risks or problems that are there. Because if you don't, a buyer will. And inevitably, when a buyer finds a big problem from a tax or legal perspective, the deal will fall over.
And if, as the statistics, the research suggests, 90% of sale transactions don't go through, you need to have that flexibility to pause it, to pull it off the market, come back at another stage.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, if you've kind of gone through some form of beauty parade, you may have kind of put off a number of your potential buyers because they've had an initial look at your business and thought there's a lot of problems there. Even if you bring it back to the market in a year or two, I'm probably not interested.
In that early stage of preparation for a sale, what are the tax considerations that should be in your mind?
Well, I think I always say to business owners that you should work with a corporate finance advisor to help you with the headline figure. Let's get the biggest number we can for your business, but then recognize that tax is going to be the biggest cost to you. So what is the tax outcome you're going to get on the sale of this business? And inevitably, an owner will say, well, I'll pay capital gains tax at 10% or 20% or whatever. And I'll say, well, do you know that for sure? So I think that for me, the first stage then is, well, while you're speaking to a commercial advisor about that headline price, let's have a deep dive to find if there's any tax problems in the business which are going to chip that value away. And then actually, what's the tax outcome going to be for you and your family on the proceeds that you receive? And then I guess because I'd name check it as well, legal issues in the business also obviously need to be considered, because if, for example, you're relying on IP, but it's not clear that you own it,
you're
not
about
going to be able to sell that business.
The mistakes that you've made and that you've learned from.
I hope so.
What are the most important ones you've learned?
It's a long list. I've already mentioned the begin with the end in mind. Understand that actually a business is on so many levels a mathematical formula that there are specific things that you do that will generate specific returns, whether that be from a profit or a multiple point of view. So without getting into the detail of that on this, there's stuff there that I was just unaware of, that business owners are not aware of. But there are some very classic ones as well. So I remember by the ultimate acquirer of my first business, he called me the chief everything officer, which is a very common syndrome for business founders. Everything was in my head. I made all the decisions. I hadn't built a proper succession team because I thought that would be expensive. But oh my word, that blew up from a value point of view when it came to a transaction. So, building a sustainable, scalable business that's not dependent on me or any other key individuals is not a bad first piece of advice, I think, for anybody thinking of a sale. And that, that's the reality. So many business owners that come to us and say, oh, I'm ready to go. And then we point out what the issues are, and there's dependency around the founder. And they then find out they've got 2 to 3 years worth of work to do when they're possibly out of energy to actually build a functional structure below them, or the option is they get locked into the business for 3 years and now they've got a boss for the first time in their life.
You've hit on exactly the point I was going to ask you about, which is you're setting out such fantastic lessons here, and it struck me that some of them are things that you needed to have got right at the start. What if the business is already running. It's been running for years.
Yeah, the longer it's been running, typically the longer it will take to unpick the dysfunctionality or whatever it is that you've got sitting in the business. But the fact is, if you don't address it, it will likely blow up when it comes to some kind of transaction. But if I go back to the begin with the end in mind now, then yeah, you can actually put the building blocks in place at the start. But the trouble is, particularly in that life cycle model, as I mentioned, there's some, I made it sound all gloom and doom, but there's some fantastic moments in there. There were times when I really felt I could do no wrong. Well, you know what? I'm afraid at that point I wasn't open to listening to people who were saying, well, maybe you need a bit more structure and a bit more process. And because I thought this was just going to carry on forever. Unfortunately, the model told me it wasn't going to, and sure enough, it didn't.
Putting yourself in the position of that entrepreneur who's running a business, has been running it for years, it's going great. Who should they be talking to right now?
I would say somebody who's been through it. And one outtake you can have from that Forbes statistic is that essentially the corporate finance industry is broken. And the reality is most of them are full of people who've never actually really owned or run a business. And I just think it's really important to be able to put yourself in the shoes or the seat of a business owner and sort of understand the journey that they're getting into.
But there are things that they can be doing.
Totally, completely and utterly. Yep, absolutely.
Even if when they started the business, they didn't have that thought that you think is so wise to have of having the end game. That's recoverable, yeah?
It's pretty much all recoverable. You've got a bigger problem if you find out late in the day that you're essentially in a business sector where there are very few transactions that happen, and there's not a active acquirer market. Well, if you've got to completely pivot the business into a different product or a different service, well, that's arguably going to take you a lot of time. But there's an awful lot of stuff you can do that I was completely uninterested in. Let's face it, a lot of entrepreneurs don't jump out of bed in the morning to say, oh, I must go and get my tax and legal and compliance and IP stuff sorted out and, PAYE audits and all these things that can blow up when it comes to a sale. We entrepreneurs normally sort of swing from the chandeliers when we're talking about new products and innovation and all that lovely stuff. But if I've got these other issues in the business, it doesn't matter how great the cool stuff is. And the chances are I end up either not selling the business or a massive discount.
Just to expand on that as well, if you have an advisor like Phil who says to someone, I'm sorry, there's just not an acquirer market in here, you cannot sell this business without a huge pivot. Actually, it's good to have broader conversations there, because you talk to a tax or legal advisor, they could say, well, here are some kind of softer exit routes you can take, which don't involve a third party, which can still achieve your aim of selling the business, but in a market where there aren't third parties who are interested.
What I'm trying to get a sense of is that this is a process. We talked about the circumstances in which entrepreneurs consider a sale, and in many cases, it's that thunderbolt moment of, oh, suddenly I've realized I'm 65, or I want to retire, or I've had enough. And that leads to sell it at any price decision. What we're discussing here is a more methodical, long-running process of keeping the business fit for sale at the most advantageous point in the future. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And it's very easy as an entrepreneur to fall in love with your business. They always use the language, it's my baby. But unfortunately, they fall out of love with their baby at some point. But the critical word for me is options, because I'm doing it now. I'm a partner in a business. We have a 3-year plan to sell the business and all those kind of things. What I want at that point is every option available to me. We might love running the business so much at that point that we decide not to sell it. Great. If we do, I'm hopeful we'll sort of maximize the return on it. And actually, I don't want to be locked into the business, so I'm going to make sure I don't have any more than one direct report in the business at that point. But it's a question of begin with the end in mind and plan for it. I think it was Wayne Gretzky, the ice hockey coach, who said the best players skate to where the puck is going to be. Well, to me, that's a totally relevant quote in this conversation.
Let's walk through some of the sort of the broader commercial and strategic things that you should keep in mind. Rather than selling all the business, selling part of the business. Talk me through that.
So, I think this comes up more commonly than people think, actually, because often you might have a business which has got a couple of strands to it, and maybe the bigger strand a buyer's interested in. And, you might agree a multiple of 6 times for that strand, actually, and the buyer says, I'll take the whole thing for 6 times. When actually that small other bit might be worth substantially more than that. And actually, from my world, a tax world, you can, if you've got more than one businesses in a company, you can extract one from another tax neutrally, effectively. but it takes time. So I think it really pays in that situation to have an advisor, a corporate finance advisor, say to you, look, this bit, don't sell it, take it out now. And you have those conversations well in advance. So you aren't trying to pick two businesses apart at the same time as selling one. But absolutely, I think you can often get to a stage where, this nascent business you're building is being undersold, when actually, if you could just kept hold of it, you could build something new.
This again chimes with our sort of theme of keeping the business fit for sale.
Correct. And I love this question because it can transform the experience and the journey of the founder. I had a conversation just this week with a guy who owns a shipping business, actually, but he's got 3 or 4 different revenue lines. And it got clear there's one that looks pretty saleable now. And if he does that, you know what? He'll clear the mortgage and won't have to worry about putting the kids through school if that's what he wants to do. And so energetically, his whole experience for the next 5-10 years will be completely different.
Flip the timescale around. Rather than talking about an entrepreneur, about company owner selling the business because they want to sell it at that time, what about when a sale comes on the horizon because somebody wants to buy it? Either the buyer approaches you or there's some sort of opportunistic circumstance where there is a buyer where there wasn't once before.
Okay. And that's obviously very common. I, on some level, give you the same answer, which is if I've been building this to sell and I know what I want to sell it for and to who, then I can look at any opportunist approach that pops up within context, as opposed to the reality of what happens, which is suddenly go, oh, here's an interesting shiny thing. Let's talk about that. And very often the conversation will develop and actually not turn into anything whatsoever. And then the business owner turns around and goes, oh, damn, I was distracted for 6 months there. And now the wheels are coming off the core business. And now I've got another year or two to get it back on track. So, having that plan in the first place means that you can look at any opportunity with context.
And again, this reinforces the idea of knowing the marketplace, knowing who the potential buyers might be and where they might emerge from.
Yes, exactly. But I think there's even a further step to that, which I'm sure Phil will have a lot to say on, which is what's the value of your business to those parties? So it's very easy to say, well, I know my business and I think it's worth X. But there might be some really huge strategic value in your business to somebody else, which means it's worth a lot more than that. So it's not only knowing your potential buyer pool, I don't think, it's also knowing what they need in their business to be a success.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite conversations. It's when you really lift the lid and go digging in a business and you try and identify what are the real assets that they've got.
This is you as an advisor.
Yeah, this is us as an advisor. A lot of businesses have got assets. They don't think of them as assets. They just built something that they need in order to run their core business. But sometimes that asset, they're not always there, but sometimes if you can identify an asset, you can then, as Rob says, you can look at that differently from the perspective of a potential acquirer. Which can then leverage the acquirer's business, which then takes you into a whole different type of conversation. We sold a health tech business earlier this year. We were part of the beauty parade of other corporate finance houses. All our competitors had said, oh, you'll get between 6 and 9 as a multiple. We said we think more is possible, not just in order to win the business, but actually we could see something sitting in the business that we thought was an asset that was highly leverageable for somebody else. And sure enough, we sold that business in March on a multiple of 21.
And again, you see that with your outsider's perspective. It's not always immediately apparent to the owner of the business.
Exactly. To come back to the research, you need a research piece at the front end. The reality is most advisors will sort of throw your business into the market and hope there's somebody out there that's interested. We're proud how few deals we do because actually we turn away most approaches. And if we can do that research bit and identify the assets, you can then take a view and say this is not only transactional, but we can get ourselves into a very interesting conversation from a multiple point of view.
Thinking about selling the business, getting the business ready for sale, and then firing the gun on the process. That takes a lot of time, attention, and focus.
It does. And I've never had a business owner say to me, I wish I hadn't spent so long building the value of my business. It's always a different conversation. It's always, I didn't spend long enough, or I didn't get around to it early enough, all those kind of things. Sometimes people say, well, how much time do I need to put into it? And I'm afraid, I don't like questions that get an answer of it depends, but I'm afraid it depends. So if you go back to the life cycle, it depends how early on in that journey you have begun to work on the value of the business. That means that when the moment comes to push the button and start a process, you are able typically to keep an eye on the business as it runs whilst also getting involved in a process. But it can consume you completely, that process, if you're not ready for it.
But even if you have prepared as best you can for it, the sale process will still demand considerable bandwidth, time, focus, attention.
It's a job in itself for that period. which could be a period of a few months. So absolutely, if you're going into that process, I think you kind of have to have a look around at the resource in your business and say, can we cope with this? And actually, if we don't think we can, we need to bring some external help in, because there's nothing worse than entering a process and things seem to be going well, but actually the business's numbers are going sideways. The buyer's seeing that, and then all of a sudden you're in that 90% case of the M&A falling over. So yeah, it's a real challenge. And I don't think there's many owners who would say at the end of a process, wow, that didn't take as much time as I thought it would. It is all consuming.
We keep coming back to this 90% of attempted sale transactions don't succeed. It does make you wonder, why do it at all?
Yeah, I'm sure if you're one of those, it does. I mean, I did manage to sell my businesses, so unfortunately I'm in the camp. But
You're in the 10%.
Well, I am, although within the
Three
here's
times.
the second statistic the Forbes have got. Of those that do sell, 70 to 80% disappoint in terms of the result. So I'm in that group. Fortunate I sold, but you know what? It wasn't a fair reflection of the risk and the stress and all the other stuff that you do. And all of this can be planned for. I'm not saying it's a magic wand that just makes all of this go away, but you can get radically different results if you plan for it based on real data.
So you've got to put in the work. You've got to do your research, do your homework, keep the business fit and ready for sale, and then be prepared to make that commitment of time once the process starts.
Correct. And, typically you need a growth story. So, the business can't stop growing. If it does, you might just lose the sale for that reason alone. As Rob says, if the numbers come off, well, then we've got a different problem.
Is there a good time to sell? Is there a bad time to sell?
Well, in relation to the life cycle model that I referenced, there's definitely good times and definitely bad times. So when I was, happy days in my business, you would have had to hose me down with a lot of money to winkle me out of that one. 2 years later, I'm saying, well, would you write me a damn check for? There's, even in a small business, there could be millions of pounds at stake there. But yeah, business life cycle is part of it. There's also the economic situation is another factor.
And I would just add to that as well. There's connected to it is the tax framework, because obviously, if you look at the situation we're in currently, tax rates are going to go up. It seems we don't know exactly when, but that should be something that comes into the mix in your thinking. As part of the macro environment assessment, effectively.
And the relevant taxes there are what?
So really, you're looking essentially at capital gains tax. If you're a non-dom at the moment, you're looking at maybe a big differential in what you might pay. And Labour have come out and explicitly said that if they come into power, they will get rid of that regime. So,
economic policy can change without the party in power having to change. We've seen that.
Yes, exactly, absolutely. So these are, again, external factors which should be taken into consideration.
Looking at the state of the economy now, if you were thinking about selling your business, should you wait?
It's obviously a very hot topic at the moment, and it's one we're very tuned into. Actually, we observe a thing called an economic clock, which is a macroeconomic view of how things sort of unfold as we go. And we're in tune with what's being said at the moment, economic correction till 2024. Actually, I've got a slide I could show you that dates back to 2007, which said from a macroeconomic perspective, there was going to be an economic correction between 2020 and 2024. So we're in that economic correction, and the different research and different data out there is a bit confusing. So on the one hand, you can look at the fact that $3.3 trillion of private equity money was not deployed between 2020 and 2022. Where's that gone? You might think that'd be ready to go, but actually, when you do the research around dry powder, as they call it, i.e. the capital, the VC and PE capital that is available to invest, that's 60% down on what it was a year ago. Valuations are down, especially in the tech sector. There's obviously a lot of sort of very public stories at the moment around that. But beware, drawing a conclusion from all of that you can't sell your business at a decent valuation. We've actually got more mandates on our books at the moment, and none of those are being affected by the economic conversation. Any of the businesses we sold in the last 12 months have not been impacted by anything that's going on in the economy. So the fundamentals remain that if your business fundamentals are sound, if it's a transactable market, there is always a high valuation to be had.
But to use the estate agent language, it's a buyer's market.
From a supply and demand point of view, it's more that at the moment. But you can look at this in different ways. If you're interested in acquisition, if you're interested in buying, then this is a fantastic time.
Well, that's exactly the point. We remember, we cast our minds back to the credit crunch and the recession that followed that. There was still an awful lot of M&A activity going on, a lot of a lot of acquisitions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there will always be competition for good assets. So if you have a good business, there's always potentially a good time to sell because there are people that want to buy that business. And we shouldn't also forget that some businesses do well in a recession. For example, there's a number of fast food restaurants I think are doing particularly well at the moment. So there will always be winners and losers. There's not just losers in any economic situation.
Phil Ives from Bean Partners, Rob Goodley from Blick Rothenberg. Such an interesting and fascinating conversation. Thank you both very much for being part of it. And if you'd like further insights around the owner-managed business lifecycle, then you can visit Blick Rothenberg's Entrepreneurs Hub for further insights. That's www.blickrothenberg.com/entrepreneurs. I'm Declan Curry. This has been the Blick Rothenberg Brave Business Podcast. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of our conversation.